so that it's not part of the recorded presentation, that would be fantastic. Before we get started today, we want to acknowledge the traditional lands and the first peoples of the land and their continued existence. So Denise and myself, we both work up in Huron County in Ontario, and that is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Attawandaron, and the Mississauga. And as conservation has a conservation authority, we work with our First Nations partners, and we are grateful to be joint stewards of the land. I'm going to turn it over to Denise now, and she's going to get us started with some flooding information.
Thanks so much, Nina. I'll just share my screen. Would you bear with me? And once again, if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them. And feel free to put them in the chat, which is a little box at the bottom, looks like a little bubble. And on the right, it should appear the option to put any questions in or comments. So once again, my name is Denise Ischuk. I work for the AuSable Bayfield Conservation Authority, and I also live on Turtle Island. This river safety quest is a journey to actually making good decisions around water so that everybody can be safe. Now, this is actually part of a greater presentation that is going into the schools and helping them to learn about these things. And I'm not doing all of these topics today. I'm going to do lesson 1 and lesson 4 and lesson 3, I think. So, decision making around water. Is there water in your community? And as such, it might be a river, it might be a creek. You can go to the beach or even to a local pond or neighborhood. So there are lots of different places where water is stored and can flow. And knowing where the water is also helpful in making good decisions around water. So where in the watershed are you? Our watershed is in an area of southern Ontario that includes 2 major river systems, the AuSable and the Bayfield. As such, we're called the AuSable Bayfield Conservation Authority. And a lot of times we can talk about where the water flows to as a watershed and the water leaving the land towards Lake Huron in this case. But we can also look at where the water starts from. And so when we look at the Bayfield headwaters, we call it, we're looking at the area between Seaforth and Dublin, where that river starts. And so the river is going to be smaller in those areas, and as it gathers water, it gets larger as it gets towards Lake Huron. And getting over to the AuSable River, the headwaters start in the Staffa area, which is also an area where the streams are very small in the creeks, and they start flowing down towards Exeter. So if you have a favorite winter activity, make sure you have an adult or a friend with you and take some safety equipment with you. You might not think, oh yeah, safety equipment could include these large things like a big reach pole or a life jacket. But depending on what you're doing, if you're snowshoeing, safety equipment could just be about making your activity comfortable for you and your friends. So maybe you want to bring some hot chocolate with you, or a snack, or some hand warmers, just in case, or a change of socks, and a first aid kit. Those items don't take a lot of room in a backpack, but they will help towards enjoying your time outside. There's also skating and those types of safety equipment. You're just doing the activity requires certain safety equipment, especially for young ones, including helmets. And maybe if you are ice fishing, you want to bring your life jacket along or an inflatable suit. So if you are going on the ice, always check the thickness of the ice and tell someone that you're going somewhere and when you're going to return. That way, if something happens, then someone knows where to look for you and they can check to make sure that you're okay depending on where you go. There's a chart here that's recommended thickness based on the Life Saving Society of Canada. I have a couple blocks here with me to demonstrate the thicknesses of the ice. So I have here a block of 10 centimeters thickness versus a block of 12 centimeters thickness. Show you with the ruler here. So the different thicknesses of the ice, oops, there we go, make it safe for different activities. And of course, the thicker it is, the safer it's going to be for the activity and the people doing that activity. Hard to imagine around here that ice could be 30 to 38 centimeters thick. But yes, people do drive on ice when it does get that thick, and that's safe for that. It's also good to check the thickness of the ice in a few different spots just to make sure that the average ice thickness between the three spots are within the guidelines of what you want to do. So if it's snowmobiling, it should be 12 average between the sites, if not even more, if you have more people on that, doing that activity. Now, you probably haven't heard much about shelf ice before, but as shelf ice is formed through wave action and the wind blowing the chunks of ice on the shore, it tends to be a mess of chunky bits of ice with air pockets, and it's quite breakable and unstable. You can even see in this picture here that sometimes with holes forming, they become areas where people can drop through and fall into the icy waters below, and not realizing that there's water below through that hole. And they might think they're more closer to the shoreline and think that, oh, there's beach underneath this ice. It's really hard. This is actually the shores of Lake Huron at Main Beach in Grand Bend. It's really hard to know where exactly the sand ends and the water begins when it's covered in ice. So there's a few safety tips for the quest of being safe this winter. Know where your water is. Always have an adult with you or friends. Take your safety equipment with you to help you feel comfortable. And always have an adult check if the ice is thick enough. And probably 1 or 2 or 3 spots. Tell someone where you're going and when you will return, and never walk on shelf ice. So there can also be flooding on the wet habitats, and we're going to get into more details about what flooding is in a moment. But first, I want to show you this short little video.
You are looking at the nightmare that happens every year across America, pushing the limits of thin ice, a day ruined, property destroyed, worst cases, lives lost. And it can happen on days like this, a seemingly normal day with just a little bit of a chill in the air. You want to be out there having fun on the lake, but it is essential to know how thick the ice is, or a fun day turn into a dangerous one. Ice thickness varies across the lake. Over there, it's right around 4 inches, which is the recommended minimum thickness for ice fishing. You can check for posted measurements, or better yet, measure for yourself like I did earlier. It's around 10 inches near me. That's a solid amount of ice to help. Whoa! Oh, those snowmobiles can really pick up speed. And if you want to be snowmobiling like those guys, make sure there's a minimum of 5 inches of ice when you ride over a lake. And speaking of riding over a lake, check this out. Some ice can support vehicles, including a pickup truck, but it needs a full foot of ice to support that weight. If you do head out, make sure to drive slowly and stay at least 50 feet away from other vehicles. The weight of the truck alone can create waves that shift and crack nearby ice, making it extremely dangerous. Honestly, if you don't need to be out driving on the lake, don't do it. Oh no. Oh, did you hear that? Oh man, there goes the truck. Let's face it, even if you got one good measurement, that ice thickness can vary over short distances, and a frozen lake is never 100% safe, although that truck is 100% toast. Scenes like that one may actually become more common across America. Winters are warming, and the ice just doesn't last as long as it used to across many North American lakes. Climate models indicate this will continue. So take precautions seriously. Make sure to check ice thickness before you head out and enjoy that day on the lake, because times like these may not be like they used to be, and they may not last much longer.
Okay, well, that's quite dramatic, courtesy of the Weather Channel. Let's look more closely. Whoops.
You are
Let's look more closely at the flooding and what it is and where it happens. So across our area, we do have a number of different rivers and streams. And as mentioned earlier, we have the Ausable and the Bayfield. We also have a major sub-watershed called Park Hill Creek. And you can see in the middle picture, it actually flows quite close to Lake Huron. And in the picture, Park Hill Creek is flooded. That means the water has flown over and overspilled its banks onto the surrounding land that is close to the river or adjacent to the river. And you can see in this picture that the ever so small trees and shrubs here show the actual distance of what the river would be. And it looks like it's about 2 to 3 times wider than it normally is at that point. Often when there's flooding, it's not a great place to build close to a river system because of that reason. And that area around a river system is called a floodplain because it is subject to flooding at different times of the year. Often, floodplains are actually used as parks or conservation areas, and I have 2 different places that you might know of. Lions Park in Seaport, there was a flooding event there in July of 2014, and you can see all the massive water that flooded that park. At Clinton Conservation Area, there is not much there on that property, but when the water does flow, it actually flows quite quickly, and it actually will divide the park in half because underneath what looks like a waterfall over here is actually a low flow crossing. So that means when the water is lower, you can actually cross that cement walkway to get to the other side of the conservation area. So trails are really affected at Clinton Conservation Area when there is high water. All kinds of animals depend and live in wet habitats. And there's some that you might see in the winter, and then others that you won't see because they're hibernating or they've migrated or they've tied off for the winter in the case of most insects. So great blue herons often visit wet habitats, and that's a migrator bird that'll leave the area. We're looking at a leopard frog. Leopard frogs will go into the water for the winter and go into a state of sleep or hibernation. Some dragonflies actually migrate, but most of them do die off in the wintertime, but they depend on water for all of their life cycle. And right now, the nymphs or the baby dragonflies are actually in the water, and they'll be fine, and they'll come out in the springtime producing new adult dragonflies. Skunks, you might see them in the wintertime too, looking for food and maybe even some water. Definitely fish, and fish are supported for all of their habitat requirements in wet areas. We have areas to lay their eggs and areas to find their food and the space that they need to swim around. And some fish will move from up and down the stream depending on what they need and what time of year they need it. The next 2 animals you might see in the water, of course, a crayfish. You probably won't see that one at all in the wintertime, but you may see a beaver. And a beaver will make holes in the ice and allow it to get in and out of the water as it goes about its daily duties in the wintertime. We also have a red-winged blackbird, which is a migrator. We have a painted turtle, which is a hibernator. It's going to be under the water, much like the frogs. And then finally, coyotes. So you'll see those animals in the winter making their way around looking for food and water. So lots of animals use the wetlands in different ways, depending on the season and depending on the availability of water. Because honestly, some wetlands, like swamps, will dry up in the springtime. But flooding can happen any time of year, especially with climate change being wetter and wilder and crazy weather. You'll never know when there is going to be a flood. So we need to be aware of those areas where there is water and when there's a potential for flooding to happen. And this hydrograph is the flow of water averaged per month over a number of years. And you can see there's a consistent peak right here in April from 1916 to 1925, meaning the waters are flowing very quickly between March, April, and then they die off more or slow down more in May. Whereas more recently, 2004 to 2013, and all the data put together actually shows increased flows for earlier in the year, December, January, and February, with a not so great of a peak in April, but still a peak. And then right at the end here in the early fall, there's also increased flow. So the changes in flow in our water, in our surroundings have definitely changed over the years, and we need to be aware all the time about the potential of flooding. So we have floods for a number of reasons. We could have it because of warming weather, which actually melts the ice and causes more water to enter into our local rivers and streams. It could be for heavy rainfall, and it could be for like crazy weather systems that come in from the lake. Also, there's ice jams. Now, with all the ice that could form in the river, not sure of the status on ice in the river right now, but in 2007, there was a lot of ice in the river, and there was an ice jam with so much ice all jumbled together. An ice jam will actually be like a dam and block the flow of water, and then that will cause flooding in those surrounding areas. So with all that ice in the river, it can cause flooding. But it also flooding depends on the ground conditions too. If you're looking from left to right, the soil on the left is unsaturated soil. So it's fairly dry, and the water, if you're looking for water, is fairly deep in the ground. That's actually in the groundwater. Now moving towards the middle picture, slightly saturated soil is going to be filled with water right up to the surface. And then flooded soil is going to be overflowing with water, and water is going to be on the surface. Now I have a couple of examples here of unsaturated soil as your typical lawn in the summertime. And then we can move towards more flooded soil that happens when there's already water in the ground, and then it starts to rain, and it rains like crazy, and then the water has nowhere to go. So it puddles and forms flooding on the land. So my safety tip for this section is to watch out for the high water. So you have to be aware of where there's going to be flooding. Now, my last section is flood control and flood response. Flood control is reducing flooding. And as a conservation authority, we do that in a lot of different ways. We do some mapping, we do some modeling, we help with planning. We encourage green infrastructure. If you look here in the middle, this is a place in Bayfield by Pioneer Park. This was typically a wet area, a ditch close to Pioneer Park, and then in recent years, a rain garden was planted there. And a rain garden is a garden that will actually love the rain, and so it will hold onto the water in that spot, and the plants will use it, and the water will be held there and stop big flows from actually getting to Lake Huron and bringing whatever with it from the road or the walkways that are close by. So kind of slows the flow of water. Now, if you look at this picture, this red line is a flood line, and we map those with geographic information systems, and you can see that this line is conveniently on the other side of where all of those houses are. So to build between the lines is not good, but to build on the outside of these lines are the places that are safe. And then in the middle would be the area that there's a river, creek, or stream. So all of these things are important to help control flooding. And we have staff that are on this regularly, monitoring, tracking the storms, issuing any flood warnings as need be. And more recently, there have been shoreline condition statements released indicating what's happening on the shoreline, because we've been getting a lot of windy weather systems that have come through and caused a lot of water to come up on the shores of the lake. And I feel people need to know those systems that are coming through. This picture with the snow, yes, we are active in the snow, and we are monitoring how much water is in the snow. Now, I took some snow from my yard just earlier, and it's been collecting here, and it's actually I've compacted it a little, but actually has got quite a bit of water in it now that it's been settling in the warmer house for a little bit. But before I brought it in, it was very fluffy, and it didn't pack very well at all. And how it packs tells us how much water, tell us how much water is in the soil, or in the snow, I mean. So those snow surveys are happening right now at different parts of the watershed, so that we can predict how much water is going to come from the land were it to melt because of warmer days or heavy rains. And on the left, we have so many different red areas highlighted here, just showing the flood-prone areas within the watershed. You might be familiar with some of these areas as well. Notice this big circle around Thetford, and this big circle that goes north of Crediton towards Exeter. And of course, if there was a flood, we would also be in charge of looking at to see how we did and to assess some of the damages if there were any. In our conservation authority, we have natural flood control, which is great. So in that Crediton flood-prone area, we actually have Hay Swamp, which is the largest swamp in the watershed, and it holds and collects water in times of flooding. So just like a sponge would, and I have some green water here for just so you can see the water. But a sponge, even though dipped in just for a little bit, can hold lots of water. And that's the same thing with Hay Swamp, that it holds lots of water. So because it's there, it can slow the flow to the rest of the watershed. And it's a great habitat that we protect. But there's also another element of flood control, and that's human-made structures. And in Park Hill, there's the Park Hill Dam. The dam and the spillway actually protects people and their property from flooding on this side going out towards Lake Huron. And there's a lot of agricultural land, and that's one of the main reasons why this dam was formed, that holding back the water is going to allow for a better growing season and, working the land as well. And I'm not sure you can understand from this picture, but this is kind of the flip-flop view. So we're looking at the reservoir. So all the area that's going to hold water if there were to be a flood and we need to hold back. So we're looking at this dam and our structure where our house our monitoring units right there. And then that's that over here. So we really are looking at it from behind towards all of the land that it's protecting. And there's quite a bit of water that can be held in this reservoir to slow the flow. So not good places to play or explore. Also culverts aren't good, and other water control structures like that found at McNaughton Park or even Clinton Conservation Area. And as a flood response, the Conservation Authority helps to teach people to plan ahead, to be prepared, and to stay informed. Just like you're looking at this video today, you're doing all of those things and hopefully becoming more prepared for any kind of flooding that might happen this spring. So we're going to continue on this presentation. So as part of what the Conservation Authority does as a response is to issue a flood warning should there require to be one. And we'll start with a watershed or shoreline condition statement, just looking at a potential of there being, I just exited out of the presentation. A potential of there being a potential flood or condition on the shoreline that we want to warn people of. And so that would be kind of the color associated with that would be yellow. Otherwise, it would be normal and it would be green and everything would be good. As things gather and are in place for potential flooding, whether that be the amount of snow on the land, the type of rain system that's coming through, the saturated conditions of the soil. We call it a flood watch, and we might issue a flood watch if there's potential for flooding. So if you want to compare that to like making cupcakes, a cupcake watch is all of the ingredients are set out on the counter and there's potential for the cupcakes to be made, but not yet. It's just a watch. We're just watching. And then the next step would be if all of those conditions or all of those ingredients get mixed up together and then the timing is right, flooding is imminent, we will issue a flood warning. Or if the making of cupcakes is imminent, the oven's going on, the spoon's going in the bowl, everything's being mixed up, then there's going to be a cupcake warning, just to go along that same metaphor of cupcakes versus flood. So a flood watch is potential for flooding, and a flood warning is going to occur or is already occurring. In the last year, the Conservation Authority issued 1 flood warning, 3 flood watches, and 10 condition statements over the last year. So yes, we did have a flood warning in the last year. So my safety tip for you is just to remember that don't play by the dams, culverts, or other water structures because they could cause injury to yourself, or we don't want you messing about in the dam either because of the high power the water that could be coming through there were there a flooding situation happening. Now, I think I've covered everything that I want to today, but if you are interested in hearing more about our flooding program, which is called River Safety Quest, our staff would be happy, myself included, would be happy to deliver an online virtual presentation looking at all different types of ways that you can be safe in your journey for being safe around water. So with that, I'm going to turn that over to Nina and see if there's any questions.
So I don't see any questions, so I think we are all done for today. So thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate you taking your lunchtime to learn a little bit about flooding. Please feel free to join us on Friday for our final lunch and learn of this series, and our topic is water and wetlands, and we're going to look specifically at animals that live in wetlands, and that's primarily geared to our K-3 students. But should be a fun exploration of who different animals are in the watershed, regardless of your age. We will also be doing another series of lunch and learns throughout March and April. So stay tuned on our website and through social media for further details on that. And with that, we hope everyone has a wonderful